program. Chinese State Councilor Yang Jiechi is spending 2 days here in Seoul to brief South Korean officials and President Moon Jae-in on the results of the talks between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Chinese President Xi Jinping. And just yesterday, the two Koreas agreed that the Inter-Korean Summit will be held at the border village on April 27th. And before I sit down with an expert to talk more about this, let's first get a check on what's making the news at this hour with our Devin Whiting at the News Center. Devin.
Hi, Jiun. President Moon is meeting with Yang Jiechi as we speak at the presidential office of Cheongwade. The meeting kicked off about half an hour ago. President Moon is expected to get a briefing from the Chinese State Councilor on the recent exchanges between China and North Korea. Yang has insisted that Kim Jong-un's recent surprise visit to Beijing and his meeting with the Chinese president will only benefit the April 27th summit between the two Koreas. He also said China will continue its support for both the inter-Korean and U.S.-North Korea summits while working with Seoul to realize the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula and to establish lasting peace in the region. Japan is once again getting involved in a sensitive territorial issue, angering South Korea at a time when Seoul and Tokyo need to work together amid the push for diplomacy with North Korea. In its official gazette released Friday, the Japanese government said it's revising high school teaching guidelines to say, wrongly, that Korea's Dokdo Island in the East Sea is Japanese territory. Park Ji-wan has more.
With the new teaching guidelines announced in the Japanese government's official gazette on Friday, Tokyo has created a legal basis to teach false and distorted information to its future generations. Publishers of school textbooks in Japan are now required by law to refer to Dokdo as Japanese territory. The textbooks for elementary schools should include such wrongful territorial claims from 2020, middle school books from 2021, and high school textbooks from 2022. Last year, the Japanese government also revised its legally binding teaching guidelines for elementary and middle school students to include incorrect territorial claims toward Korea's easternmost island, Dokdo. Back in 2008, Japan first started to include the provocative claim that Korea and Japan do not share a common understanding on Dokdo in its non-legally binding middle school teaching guideline commentary, causing strong protests and a backlash from the Korean government. So now it seems that for the last 10 years, despite official protests from Korea, Japan has made its education system, from elementary school to high school, teach students these false territorial claims. The South Korean government has strongly condemned the Japanese government's move, urging it to immediately repeal its legally binding teaching guidelines that make false claims over the Korean territory. Seoul's foreign ministry summoned the Japanese ambassador to South Korea, Yasumasa Nagamine, Friday morning, and South Korea's first vice foreign minister, Im Seong-nam, delivered the South Korean government's position, urging the Japanese government to repeal the wrongful guidelines. The Foreign Ministry also issued a statement that Dokdo is historically, geographically, and legally Korea's territory, which was first invaded and occupied during Japan's past attempt to colonize Korea, vying to sternly respond to any of such moves. The statement added that if Japan continues to fail to see its errors of imperialistic aggression in the past, it will lose a precious opportunity to learn from the past and prepare for the future. Korea's Education Ministry also issued a statement saying this move of a historical distortion not only violates Korea's territorial sovereignty, but also damages the peaceful coexistence and mutual respect of East Asia. The Education Ministry stressed that the Japanese government should teach its future generations the preciousness of peace based on the correct view of history. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
U.S. President Donald Trump might be planning to put a hold on the recent changes to America's FTA with South Korea. He says he would use it as a card in his negotiations with the North. As our Lee Seung-jae reports, it's not obvious what the U.S. would stand to gain from that.
Before the ink has even dried on the newly amended South Korea-U.S. FTA, President Trump said he may hold up the trade deal in order to use the deal as leverage in any upcoming negotiations with North Korea and their nuclear program. Calling it a strong card, Trump made it clear how he wants to use the trade deal.
Just this week, we secured a wonderful deal with South Korea, and I may hold it up till after a deal is made with North Korea. Does everybody understand that? Do you know why, right? Do you know why? Because it's a very strong card. And I want to make sure everyone is treated fairly, and we're moving along very nicely with North Korea. We'll see what happens.
Observers say it's unclear how holding up the trade deal with South Korea, one of America's closest allies, could help the U.S. in dealing with North Korea. This comes as U.S. diplomats have emphasized that any meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un would simply be a meeting and not a formal negotiation on the North's nuclear weapons program. Meanwhile, the South Korean government on Thursday demanded the U.S. correct a recent statement on the U.S. Trade Representative website, stating that the U.S. Treasury Department is leading discussions on currency with South Korea's finance ministry. Adding to the dispute was a fact sheet issued by the U.S. Trade Representative on Wednesday, stating that a memorandum of understanding is being finalized on robust provisions to prohibit competitive devaluation and exchange rate manipulation. According to Seoul's Ministry of Strategy and Finance, the exchange rate issue is entirely unrelated to the FTA, as such an agreement would likely deal a heavy blow to South Korea, as it's such an export-dependent economy. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, Russia has announced the expulsion of more than 150 diplomats, including 60 Americans, in a tit-for-tat response to the West's move over the poisoning of a former Russian spy in England. Noah Ram reports.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Thursday that Russia is expelling 60 U.S. diplomats and officials in retaliation for identical U.S. measures announced earlier this week. They have 1 week to leave, and the U.S. consulate in St. Petersburg will also be shut in retaliation for the closure of the Russian consulate in Seattle.
U.S. Ambassador Mr. Huntsman has been invited to our ministry, where my deputy Mr. Ryalkov briefs him on our response to the U.S. These measures include the expulsion of the same number of diplomats, and this includes our decision to withdraw the license for the U.S. consulate in St. Petersburg.
Lavrov has blamed Washington for leading the mass expulsion of Russian diplomats in the West and said Moscow will enforce similar measures on countries that joined it. U.S. State Department spokeswoman Heather Nauert said the Russian move was unjustified.
I want to remind you that there is no justification for the Russian response. Our actions were motivated purely by the attack on the United Kingdom. So we are reading this, we are reviewing it, and will respond accordingly.
More than 24 nations have joined the UK in pointing the finger at Moscow for the nerve agent attack on Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury earlier this month. The Kremlin has repeatedly denied involvement, and Lavrov again described the actions against his country as provocative. He added Russia is also seeking a meeting with the leaders of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to discuss the case. Meanwhile, doctors treating Sergei Skripal's daughter, Yulia, say she is recovering quickly. She is known to be conscious and speaking, but her father remains in critical condition. British police believe the Soviet-era Novichok nerve agent had been left on the front door of Mr. Skripal's home in Salisbury. Noah Ram, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines for this hour.
So yesterday, the two Koreas agreed to hold the highly anticipated summit between South Korea and North Korea on April 27th at the inter-Korean border, although the agenda for the meeting is still up in the air. Our Oh Jung-hee has more.
The two Koreas will hold their third historic summit on April 27th at the Peace House located on the South Korean side of the truce village of Panmunjom. The announcement came after high-level delegations from Seoul and Pyongyang wrapped up their meeting at Panmunjom on Thursday afternoon.
South and North Korea agreed to work together to successfully hold an inter-Korean summit in view of the historic significance it will have in terms of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, building peace, and improving inter-Korean relations. With the agreement of both leaders, the South and the North have decided to hold the 2018 Inter-Korean Summit on April 27th at the Peace House in Panmunjom.
For now, it's expected that the Seoul-Pyongyang summit will only last a day. To prepare, the two Koreas will hold a couple of working-level talks. The first round will be held on April 4th to discuss protocol, security, and press coverage for the summit. The second meeting will cover communications, but when and where it's held hasn't yet been decided. Seoul and Pyongyang will continue exchanging documents as they prepare. South Korea has had three major topics for President Moon Jae-in to discuss with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un: denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, building a lasting peace with lower tensions, and finally improving inter-Korean relations. The two Koreas agreed Thursday that the three items should be taken up at the summit, but the topics couldn't be narrowed down any further. Asked about the agenda of the summit, North Korea's Lee Sun-kwon only said, quote, "Our agenda covers everything in inter-Korean relations." Seoul has also left open the possibility of holding another round of high-level talks in April to iron out the details. The North Korean side did not mention anything about denuclearization at Thursday's high-level talks, but South Korea's unification minister reaffirmed that denuclearization is a central topic that's been discussed since the January 9th high-level talks and during several trips back and forth between Seoul and Pyongyang. 오정희, Arirang News.
And to tell us more about the outcome of yesterday's inter-Korean meeting, as well as increased cooperation from China in regards to the upcoming North Korea summits, Dr. Ko Myung-hyun, a research fellow at the Azza Institute for Policy Studies, joins us in the studio today. Welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure for me to be here.
All right, so let's start off by going back in time a little bit and looking at the past inter-Korean summits, which happened back in year 2000 and 2007. So in what ways will the April 27th summit differ from the second and first summits?
There are some important differences compared to the two previous summits, first one in the year 2000 and second one in 2007. The first summit took place in a much positive circumstances than compared to now. The nuclear crisis in North Korea had been contained through diplomatic channels called the Agri Framework. So the main issue of the first inter-Korean summit was more about inter-Korean reconciliation. And also there's a symbolism of being the first ever meeting between the top leaders of the two Koreas.
Right.
So that was a very important event in that sense. With the second summit, in a way, the second summit is something that I think President Moon is trying to avoid with his first summit with Kim Jong-un. The reason is because the second summit, which was a meeting between Kim Jong-il, the current North Korean leader's father, and then Roh Moo-hyun, the former president, it took place at the end of President Roh Moo-hyun's presidency. So in that sense, whatever commitment or agreement that the two Koreas decided to have at the meeting didn't hold up, because President Roh wasn't there anymore, so to speak, to work on his end of the deal. So in that sense, that's actually an important lesson, I think, for President Moon. And for that reason alone, I think President Moon wanted to have his first summit with Kim Jong-un as soon as possible, way early in his presidency. So in that sense, I think the South Summit is very interesting, because and it's likely to be more effective than the second summit. And another important, remarkable feature of the third summit is that this is taking place in the overall framework of denuclearization negotiation between North Korea and the United States. And because this third summit is taking place before the tentative summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un set for end of May. It will act like as a priming event, so to speak, to prepare North Korea to start a negotiation or talks with the United States. So this is actually very remarkable as well.
So making this Seoul summit even more important, because it's going to continue into the U.S.-North Korea summit.
That's right, but at the same time, it depends on the intention of the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, how he wants to make use of this summit with President Moon. If Kim Jong-un wants to use this event as a way to set the agenda for the U.S. DPRK summit, he was going to talk about denuclearization quite a bit. If not, it's going to be more about the inter-Korean dialogue.
All right. Well, the two sides did agree to hold this summit on the southern side of the Peace Village in Panmunjom, which means the North Korean leader, for the first time, will be setting his foot on South Korean soil. So what significance does this carry?
Well, obviously, literally speaking, it's the very first time that the leader of North Korea will be setting foot in the southern side of the DMZ. after the Korean War. So in that sense, this is very significant and symbolic. And I think North Korea could make a major event out of this, such as maybe showing Kim Jong-un crossing this now well-known borderline between North and South, which is marked by a bunch of number of bricks. But then also there's another way for him to get to the meeting place, which is called the Peace House on the southern side of the Panmunjom. Will be getting there by car. But I think, in a way, I think Kim Jong-un will be thinking about what will be the best way to achieve most dramatic effect. But then at the same time, he has to take into account that the Panmunjom happened to be a place, a location where a lot of defections took place.
Right.
And this defection took place by defectors just crossing this symbolic dividing line between the North and South. So if Kim Jong-un does the same thing, straddling the border, crossing the symbolic line between the North and South, I think there could be quite a bit of a repercussion in the internet, people comparing Kim Jong-un crossing the border with previous defections.
All right. Well, officials from both sides will be meeting next Wednesday for further working-level talks ahead of the inter-Korean summit. Now, of course, all eyes are on whether the discussions will include the issue of denuclearization.
So that's what I was mentioning before. I think North Korea would probably bring up the issue of denuclearization, but I think the extent to which the denuclearization is going to be discussed, I don't think it's going to be like a very deep. I think it will be more about bringing out a general sort of agreement in principle between the two Koreas about the need for a complete denuclearization. But I don't think North Korea is going to discuss with South Korea about the details or the mechanisms in which North Korea is going to implement its own self-denuclearization. So I think it's going to be more about political event where North Korea and South Korea affirm their commitment to peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula and the continuation of the inter-Korean dialogue.
Now, today, top Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi, who came to Seoul actually yesterday, has been meeting with Seoul officials here and also briefing President Moon on the Beijing talks between Kim Jong-un and Chinese President Xi Jinping. So how detailed do you think the briefing was?
Well, I'm not really privy to the meeting, obviously, and I'm not sure how much we'll hear about it from the Blue House or from China, from the Chinese government. But then what I can guess is that the briefing would have been quite, extensive. And the reason is because I don't think the meeting between Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un went into the details of the future situation, future, like a scenario in the Korean Peninsula, how to settle down the denuclearization. We know that we already know about it. We know what North Korea wants, which is a step-by-step negotiation.
Right.
And China agreed with that. But then I think in that sense, the briefing is not going to be that interesting. But what's more important and most people are curious about is how China was able to invite Kim Jong-un to Beijing and then bring him over to Beijing so quickly.
Right.
So I don't think that's something that China is going to display to President Moon at this moment.
All right. Well, what's notable, though, is that South Korea and China have obviously been closely cooperating in matters regards to North Korea, which is something that we couldn't possibly expect even last year when the whole THAAD controversy was ongoing.
Right. That's quite correct. But then we have to think that now we have a new, different administration in South Korea compared to the previous administration, which emphasized sanctions, containment of North Korea. And this current Moon administration puts priority on stability and dialogue, which very much is in sync with what China policy towards North Korea or the Korean Peninsula is. We know China puts priority on 3 points when it comes to the Korean Peninsula: stability, denuclearization, and whole conflict should be resolved through dialogue. And that's something that I think President Moon is very much in agreement with. I think that's the reason why we have a lot of overlap between China and South Korea at this moment.
All right. Now, going back to what you just said before about Kim Jong-un mentioning taking step-by-step or gradual denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but it kind of sounds like his father, Kim Jong-il's old tactics, in which we saw a gradual freezing and scrapping of nuclear weapons from North Korea in exchange for more economic aid and also easing of tensions, which in the end we saw, it failed. So we don't want to repeat those mistakes again.
That's correct. And but it's in the interest of North Korea to take the step-by-step approach to denuclearization, because holding on to the nuclear weapon is the ultimate security guarantee for North Korea. And in a way, it's a reasonable approach, because despite all the past cases of failure and implementing this kind of framework with North Korea, it's going to be very difficult to have convince a nuclear state. It's not officially a nuclear state, but the de facto nuclear state like North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons in peacetime. There's no such precedent in history at all. There are some exceptional cases, but these are really exceptional. So, and then in that sense, the reasonable approach is going to be a step-by-step approach, especially when there's a lack of trust between the United States and North Korea at the moment. And so the most likely scenario is that even the United States, if it wants to have some sort of a deal with Kim Jong-un, will have to be flexible and then accept the fact that there should be some step-by-step approach. But then, obviously, the devil is in the details.
Right.
And this time, I think the United States is going to demand North Korea to take irreversible steps every time to make sure that each step it's not reversible to allow North Korea to denuclearize again. So I think that's going to be the key difference.
All right, so here's a question that I have then. How sincere do you think North Korea is when it comes to really denuclearization?
So really, it's a matter of definition, I believe, at this point. I think North Korea is definitely not committed to complete denuclearization, but then it might be committed to some partial denuclearization, just for the negotiation's sake. And we have to understand that North Korea is demanding something in exchange for their own denuclearization commitment, which is security guarantees. And there's a lot of ways we can interpret, we can understand what security guarantees could be for North Korea. And chances that North Korea is going to demand a similar stand down in our posture towards North Korea, essentially our active deterrence posture, meaning with the centerpiece of which would be the US-ROK alliance. So if North Korea can get some sort of a scaling down or even the dismantlement of our security alliance with the United States, then I think North Korea could be willing to, in principle, to give up much of its nuclear weapons. But when it comes to complete denuclearization, it could be unlikely.
All right. Well, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has been quite actively reaching out to other countries, including South Korea, the U.S., and China, perhaps putting himself up in the global stage as a national leader. But now we're wondering, how likely is he to, expand his scope of diplomacy to Russia?
Oh, that's very likely. We already know that there's a visit by the foreign minister of North Korea, Yang scheduled for the middle of next month. So we already know that. So North Korea is already reaching out to Russia. It's in the interest of North Korea to count Russia on their side when it comes to how to form a coalition, so to speak, before starting the negotiation with the United States. But when it comes to a higher level meeting, say like the summit between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, that also could be possible. But then the chance is that time is kind of running. Time is short. There's not much time between now and the upcoming Inter-Korean summit,
the Trump and
Kim summit. So, but then there could be a quick meeting between President Putin and Kim Jong-un, say after the Inter-Korean summit, if North Korea perceives that the U.S. stands towards North Korea is still very much hardline.
Now, Japan has been very concerned about the so-called Japan passing, and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe wanted to have a summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. How likely do you think that will happen?
Well, it really depends on the Japanese stance towards North Korea. I think if there's going to be a summit between Abe and Kim Jong-un, it's likely to be one of the most transactional summits when North Korea is going to have this year, meaning so far North Korea was meeting with the leaders of South Korea, China, United States, or possibly Russia in order to gain political advantage or strategic advantage to prepare for the nuclear negotiations. With Japan, there's no such urgency for North Korea. So it could be, the only reason why North Korea could be meeting with Abe would be to gain economic assistance or other concessions. So it's going to be one of the most transactional ones. It's up to Japan to offer those incentives to North Korea in order to have the summit.
All right. Thank you so much for your insight today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And that wraps it up for today and this week, but we'll be back next week with more of the day's top stories and an in-depth look at ongoing issues here in Korea and around the world, so don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching and see you soon.
K-beauty charms the world. Beyond Asia to Europe and America, winning the hearts of women worldwide.